Good morning, and welcome to our first panel on the fundamental immigration law and policy that underlies the crisis at the border and the cruelty of the border as we know it today. I'm pleased to introduce Linus Chan, who is my colleague and the director of the Detainee Rights Clinic at the University of Minnesota's Binger Center for New Americans. And Serene Shabaya is joining us virtually from Washington, D.C. She is the executive director of the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild. Welcome, Serene and Linus. And
should I start?
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome on a Friday morning. Thank you for everyone coming here and, of course, inviting me to speak. Now, my job is to do a little bit of a historical basis, but I want people to think instead of just throwing out facts and dates and people's stories, which I will do, I want us to start with the idea of what it's like to be in the, to have borders being imposed upon you and how that impacts people's lives and what it means when it's feeling that sense of injustice. Because so often when we're talking about law, right, the idea of law is that it's supposed to help impose and express what we feel is just. But I want us to start this conversation by thinking about what levels and how people that were caught in these border situations would feel from a justice perspective and why and how that impacts us today. All right? So I apologize if my history lesson is a little bit too rudimentary for some people, but I think it's important to get that going to a certain extent. Okay, so first of all, I apologize. I know I flipped the words on the title of our symposium. It's my bad. Just take it to I'll just ask for forgiveness. All right, does this work? Can you flip to the first? Okay, do I have to do it up there? Okay. Oh, point it there. That's not working. Okay, I'll cue you. First slide, please. So let's go with what the United States looked like in 1830, right? If we were talking about borders from 1830, we would be talking about a very different country, okay? And I think it's important to see, right, that Mexico had won its independence from Spain only less than 10 years before this, all right? So, but at the same time, if you were living in, let's say, the middle of Texas, and let's say you were an indigenous person, you have, at this point in time, seen probably your third country lay claim to your land and who you are, what government it was. And what ends up happening, go ahead, next slide, is, of course, you see now that instead of just Mexico, what do we have here? We have what's called the Republic of Texas. Now, what's the story that we've heard about Texas? One of the stories, of course, is Alamo. But of course, there's a lot to underlie this story about the Republic of Texas. What had been happening in the 1820s and 30s were that a lot of white settlers, slave owners, were moving into Texas. And so imagine that you are that indigenous landowner. You had your own land in Texas for generations. And what was happening was more and more people were moving in. And not only were they moving in, they were moving in and bringing slaves. All right, but what happened? Well, the Mexican government outlawed slavery by 1829. They said, we are going to outlaw slavery in the entire country of Mexico. This did not sit well with the white settlers who had brought their slaves into Texas. and a battle ensued. And of course, Santa Anna made a huge miscalculation and lost one of the most key battles, and Texas was able to, quote unquote, declare their independence by 1836. Now, was the US just standing by and saying, yeah, we'll see what happens? No, because a lot of the movement of those white settlers into Texas was encouraged by the US government. And so by this point, there was an agreement in 1845, go ahead and go to the next slide, where the United States says, okay, we're going to go ahead and annex Texas as part of the United States. And you can imagine the sort of feelings this would engender with Mexico. They saw it rightfully as a very aggressive aspect of what was going on in their country. And you see, of course, then there was the Mexican-American War that shortly followed. And in one of the most sort of crazy situations, which involved a person who was not authorized to negotiate the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, you notice that the United States grew substantially. California became part of the United States, Texas, and very quickly, by the way, California became a state in 1850, very, very shortly after the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And Texas was also allowed to enter a state. Next slide. Oh, sorry, click. Okay, here we go. And of course, you see in 1854, this was the situation right before the Civil War. You had Texas as a slave state, California, quote unquote, as a free state. And Mexico, of course, was in their own situation, right? Mexico, by 1857, passed a constitution that was becoming very important. But I'm going to skip Mexico for now. I'll go back to Mexico and go to all around the other side of the world, which is the Second Opium War. Now, in some ways, if you read a little bit about the Opium Wars, you can kind of get an idea that it might have been an inspiration for Breaking Bad, right? And why is that? Well, it's because the Opium Wars was a war fought to allow drug dealers to deal drugs. And that's the only way, really, it could be charitably read. Because what had happened was, in China, the Qing dynasty was having the Western powers, including Great Britain and Spain and France, and what did they want? They wanted to sell opium. And the Qing dynasty said, you know what? We don't like what opium is doing to our populace. We're going to outlaw it. And Great Britain and the Western powers didn't like that. And so they started a series called the Opium Wars. And the Opium Wars was because they wanted to sell opium. Now, the United States during the Second Opium War was technically neutral, except in one of the most key battles, which involved the ransacking of the capital of China. The United States ended up with a warship firing upon the Chinese and helping the Great British. Some records are saying that the United States might have, turned the tide of that battle. It's sort of unclear. But what was really interesting was at the end of the Second Opium War, a treaty was made with the Western colonial powers and China, and the United States became a party to that treaty. And one of the things that the United States wanted in that treaty was trade. Okay, so a few things just to jump ahead a little bit. 1862 was the Anti-Coolie Act, which was supposedly an anti-slavery provision because they viewed coolie labor, which involved contract labor, as a form of slavery. And then in 1869, of course, was the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. One thing I wanted to highlight here is there was a lot of recruitment of Chinese labor during this period of time, right? Why? Because international slave trade was already banned. Despite the Civil War fighting domestic slavery, the United States and Great Britain had already banned slavery as an international trade. So Chinese were viewed as cheap labor. And that's what ended up happening during this period of time. But of course, after there was a Great Depression towards the end of the 1870s, and what naturally happened is the tide turned and anti-Chinese sentiment built. All right, let's go to the next one. And you can see the sort of anti-Chinese sentiment. I want to say, you see the back door, and what was happening was very famously in 1882, the United States passed its first version, right, of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, it's a couple things that's really important to understand. Prior to 1882, the United States had entered a treaty with China called the Burlingame Treaty. Burlingame was actually sent by Lincoln, by Abraham Lincoln, to negotiate this treaty. And part of that treaty gave the United States and China what's called most favored nation status. Part of that provision in that treaty was to allow for free immigration from China to the United States, as well as, and this was really important for the United States, free trade and migration to China. But by the 1800s, that tide really turned. There was the Exclusion Act and the Scott Act. A couple things about that became, the Chinese who were living in the United States felt that these were extremely racist and unfair laws. And so what they ended up doing is they started to, as you can see, started to cross the borders without papers and illegally. That's just dying of thirst in the desert, and this is a Chinese person crossing from the southern border. And then this, you can see that the Wasp, which was a very famous anti-Chinese newspaper during that time. Now, I want to say a couple things about the northern border and then the southern border, and then I have to really speed things up, okay? So, one of the things about this what was happening is Canada and the United States were not completely in lockstep yet. Canada was not banning all Chinese, they were charging a head tax. But what they would also do is they say, you Chinese don't have to pay the head tax within the first 90 days. So Chinese people would land in Canada, and guess what they would do? They would cross into the border into the United States. Now, at the time, that was the Oregon territories. What was happening was the United States would catch these Chinese, and the Chinese Exclusion Act said, hey, you have to detain them. You have to, not only that, you have to deport them. But the law said you had to deport them from whence they came, which meant not to China, but to Canada. Canada, at the same time, said, you know what, we're not taking them. You have to pay the head tax. And of course, the US government says, we're not going to pay $50 a head tax, even though we're spending $20 a day to detain them. So you had people being detained, and this is called McLean Island Penitentiary in the Northwest, for up to 4 years, simply because Canada won't take them and US didn't know how to deport them. And it wasn't until a Treasury official later on reinterpreted and said, you can go ahead and send them all the way back to China rather than from whence they came, that changed. All right. I'm skipping over a few things. Notice how eventually Canada did say, okay, we'll exclude the Chinese. So the Chinese were not using the northern border. But what was a really interesting provision of the Mexican Constitution in 1857 was in Article 11 of the Constitution said it guaranteed the right of immigration and free migration. In fact, I want to try to read this real quick. All men have the right of entering and leaving the republic, of traveling through its territory, etc. And so when the United States, as they did with Canada, tried to get Mexico to exclude the Chinese, the Mexicans pointed to their constitution and said, we can't do that. We are going to go ahead and let the free migration of the Chinese in. Of course, the US response is to militarize the border. All right. I'm now going to be talking a little bit about what's happening here. So this was very effective, by the way. when the Border Patrol started in 1920s, and then the certain on later. Now, this was the Bath Riots. I wanted to talk a little bit about Mexican migration, right? There was the Mexican Revolution had happened and sort of ended in the 1911, I believe. And so there was a lot of movement of Mexican workers into the United States. Remember, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo meant a lot of Mexico became the United States, but there was a lot of traditional generational ties and people would move in. Labor was needed in the United States, and of course people were moving. But in 1917, there was a few provisions that included a literary test and a head tax that was used to really police Mexicans. And this was a 1917, what's called the Bath Riots of 1917. And it was started by a 17-year-old Mexican woman named by Carmelita Torres, who was referred to as being red-haired. And she started to protest these kerosene baths. When laborers were required to be doused in kerosene, and then later by the 1950s were required to be doused and deloused with DDT. Now, of course, the young woman was objecting mostly because she had heard rumors first that there was a group of Mexican prisoners in El Paso jail who were burned alive because of an unlit cigarette and kerosene bath at the same time, which was true. And secondly, because she thought that they were taking naked pictures of the women in this process. The Bath Riots happened for a period of time, but did not stop the process. And I'm gonna quickly go from there. That's the Palmer raids. This is the Mexican repatriation of 1930s, right during the Great Depression. It's very interesting. Social workers are one of the biggest drivers of convincing Mexican Americans, not just Mexicans, but Mexican Americans, from going back to Mexico because of the fear that it would drain our social security system. They did so both in saying that you will get your benefits if you leave the United States, and then of course they never got the benefits. They were trained and forced onto trains. There was a lot of scare tactics used, and I'm running out of time. So I will also just point out really quickly, you might have heard, there's also Operation Wetback, and then which we could talk about the militarization of that because it was led by a Lieutenant General Joseph Swing. And of course, the 1940s saw a rise in forced sterilization because of the ideas of the eugenic movement and all that. So I will go ahead and drop that. Sorry, I had to speak really quickly. But.
Thank you, Linus. And now let's turn to Serene Shabaya. Hi, Serene.
Okay, perfect. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Serene Shabaya, as Kathy mentioned, and I'm the executive director of the National Immigration Project. My pronouns are she and her, and it's really a delightful honor for me to be here with both Linus, who is actually someone that my organization honored with an award a couple of years ago, and with Kathy, who is one of our most trusted and esteemed board members of the organization. So it's delightful for me to be here with both of them, and delightful to be with all of you. I wish I could be there in person, but of course we're still kind of, not doing that as much. I think that Linus's coverage of the history really kind of sets up the themes that I want to hit on here, which are much more about how these racist histories play out right now in the way that our border is handled and in the way that people coming across the border are welcomed or not welcomed by a very sort of aggressive policing and enforcement apparatus that meets them as they make this very difficult journey over. So the history that Linus described also ties in with another piece of the same sort of orientation in history, which is that at a certain point in time in the 1920s, there was a decision made to make the act of crossing the border a crime. And that is something that I want to sort of pause on for a few minutes, because I really do think that it is the place where the kind of literal way that migrants are criminalized in our system is most apparent. And in the border context. And before I turn to the current impact of these prosecutions and efforts to challenge them, I just want to pause for a moment to talk about their history. These laws were enacted in 1921 at the height of the eugenics movement, and they were enacted with the specific purpose of keeping Mexican immigrants out of the United States. The legislative records for the enactment of those laws includes a discussion of the importance of keeping US, quote, blood white and purely Caucasian, end quote, rather than having it infected by people from other backgrounds and races. The record also, the same legislative record also reflects anti-Black racism, reflects a number of racial slurs that were used kind of casually to describe people crossing the border. And because I don't want to spend my time repeating this disgusting language, I will, pass on to Kathy, who maybe perhaps can pass on to all of you, an amicus brief that sort of lays out some of that language in great detail, and which actually might already be linked, but it might not. I'll make sure that Kathy has it to share with you. But if you wanted to sort of peruse the very kind of graphic language that was used in the passage of these laws, just to kind of show that really it's indisputable that those laws were enacted specifically with racist intent and to keep certain people out of the US. And today, the impact of these prosecutions continues to be as intended. Imagine the fact of like walking for weeks, in some cases for months, across deserts and terrible circumstances to make it to a border because that is your best choice in that moment in time. And then coming here and being put in jails in terrible conditions and then prosecuted. And from 1998 to 2018, there has been a 120% increase in the prosecution of migrants. And unauthorized entry or re-entry continues to be the most commonly prosecuted federal quote unquote crime. So consider this, like with all the language about, resources being spent in good ways and prosecutorial discretion and all of that, this is still the most commonly prosecuted crime, just the act of crossing the border. And 98% of the people prosecuted under these laws are Hispanic or Latinx. So after taking a harrowing journey to come here, they are shuttled through proceedings that they frequently do not understand. They are denied access to attorneys who can help them with their immigration cases. They are separated from their loved ones, and they are put in private prisons with horrifying conditions that are pretty well documented to serve out sentences for the simple act of crossing the border. This to me is one of the most sort of stark ways that our border is truly sad. It is sad because it is not acknowledging sort of the realities of human movement, and it continues to function to shut out Black and brown immigrants from the United States. So that is sort of one aspect of that border. Another point that I will mention is Title 42. And just that entire, some of you, I assume that you all roughly know what that is, but under the Trump administration, Stephen Miller was very actively advocating for use of certain emergency health powers to shut down the border. And he was advocating for this well before the COVID pandemic, but then the COVID pandemic came around and gave him just such an excuse. And he managed to sort of work with others in the White House to get the CDC to issue an order under something called Title 42 of the US Code that allows the government to shut down the border. And so essentially what they did is they shut down the border to anyone coming, and people coming to the border were simply expelled. And this actually hit particularly Haitian migrants incredibly hard because they were coming to the border and getting expelled without any chance to apply for asylum. Our system is already very restrictive in that way. Like if you come to the border, you basically have one shot to say that you have a fear of return or to be able to apply for asylum. It's very little process. It's already kind of a devastating circumstance. People don't really understand like the system or what are the relevant things that they should be highlighting. But even that was taken away from them under Title 42. And so under the current enforcement system, it just essentially became like people come, they get expelled, back to dangerous circumstances, they come again, they get expelled again. And the Biden administration, unfortunately, kind of succumbed to political pressure and kept that order in place. But then finally, a few weeks ago, announced that it was going to take the order down. And then a bunch of states that resisted mask mandates went to court and sued and said, we don't want to have to wear a mask, but we think that asylum seekers are a COVID safety threat. Like it's just an extremely kind of hypocritical landscape, to say the least. But what that has meant is that Title 42 continues to be in place. So people are still being expelled when they come to the border, unless they meet certain specific exemptions. And what that means is that they don't get a chance to seek asylum, and they're still sort of, predominantly Black and brown immigrants. And we saw and we know that the government has the ability to very quickly and humanely process people, because they did that for Ukrainian people coming to the border and trying to cross that way. But they haven't sort of applied that same principle to others who are trying to cross the border. The last thing I'll mention very quickly, because I know we're kind of short on time and I want to get to questions, is detention at the border. I mean, this applies, all of these things that I'm talking about apply not just at the border, but also more generally within the immigration system. But since we're focusing on the border, I just kind of want to elevate like just how horrifying it is that after people have taken this harrowing journey, they come to the border and then they are put in these freezing, essentially they call them ice boxes. They're basically like large cages. They're given nothing but a Mylar blanket. Their possessions are frequently confiscated, oftentimes not returned to them. That actually includes medicine as well, or other critical things that they need, like supplies for their children, things of that nature. And it's just like a horrifying picture of what people experience when they come here. You see like, masses of humanity being put in completely overcrowded conditions in these holding facilities, where really there's no reason for that to be the way that we welcome people when they come to the United States. And so I think, seeing all of that, and the one last thing that I actually also wanted to mention is that then the government also kind of targets and harasses humanitarian groups at the border that are trying to provide assistance or water or like a first aid kind of station consistently over the years. And even though that kind of harassment sort of decreases under more favorable administrations, it kind of continues to happen at a low level. So like people who are trying to provide humanitarian assistance at the border frequently experience run-ins with CBP, frequently experience problems coordinating on search and rescue, and frequently experience targeting and harassment at their aid camps. So that's just another way in which our border is kind of sad and cruel. And instead of ending on this depressing note, I actually kind of want to end on saying that I think that the way to get out of all of that is not to only think about what are the minor small changes around the edges that we can make, but to actually try to imagine a different world. Like imagine a world where Chinese exclusion didn't happen, or imagine a world where we didn't suddenly start shutting down the border for no reason, and where we acknowledge that human movement is a normal part of life and that it happens for a variety of reasons, and where we treat borders as welcoming centers instead of shutting out and kind of enforcement centers. And I think that if we spend some time trying to imagine what such a reality would look like, I mean, it's happening in the EU, right? Like within the EU states, there isn't really this kind of, intense border system that exists in the same way as it does here. I think that there's a lot of ways that we can kind of rethink welcoming people and then set up centers in border areas that are more targeted towards supporting people and helping them find what they need in order to successfully make a journey here and a journey back. And I think that, if we imagine such a system where people can freely come and go, a lot of the tension points around immigration would actually fall away. And so my invitation to everyone at the symposium is to take some time to kind of let our previous assumptions and our kind of deep familiarity with how things work now sort of go for a while, and maybe practice a meditation exercise of thinking about what welcoming centers at the border could look like if we didn't actually have an enforcement apparatus.
I have one question for both of you. We have a couple of minutes. As the government has enhanced its militarization of the border and its efforts to keep people out, putting people in these overcrowded camps and that type of thing, how has that impacted undocumented migration?
I'll just touch upon it because I wanted to touch upon this a little bit. Like one of the key parts, I think, historically is looking at Operation Wetback, which is the name of the operation, which was led by a West Point classmate of the president, Joseph Story, really started this idea of deportation and border enforcement very much as a militarization of the border. And I will say that I used to take students down to the border every year, and one of the things I would take the students to is to do a tour of the Border Patrol station. And you could see, like, one of the most interesting aspects is this was right before the child surge, and they were talking about all of the military equipment they have. And I want to be clear, like, the U.S. border is one of the most surveilled. The first use of drones was on the U.S. border. The ability for towers to look 100 miles into the Mexican country, into Mexico, to decide where and how to navigate border enforcement. And I do think that what that has done, of course, is it's made the border more deadly, because it forces people to make more dangerous crossings in a way that risks their life and limb. So I don't know, Serene, if you wanted to.
I don't really have a lot to add to what Linus said, but I will say that what we have seen traditionally is that the more enforcement there is, the more chaos that creates at the border. So like, it's actually the opposite of the received wisdom. Like, for example, in the Title 42 context, they talk about like, oh, there were 1.8 million touches, like with people or contacts with people, but like most of those were repeat contacts with people, because people who are coming to the border have a very good reason to come to the border. And if you just expel them, they're just going to come back, because those same reasons that drove them to come, you know, drive them to come again. And that kind of creates like a lot of, you know, stress and the need, you know, increased enforcement and all of the things that we hear about. And I think that that's true across the board, that when you see very harsh enforcement, you end up seeing more people trying to cross irregularly and more sort of cascading effects overall.
Yeah, I wanted to touch upon this because there was some really great sociological research that were looking at what the Chinese were absolutely crossing the borders clandestinely. They started to use what's called paper tigers. But the reason why is they thought that laws were so unfair, they had no respect for what their purpose was. And so I think there was a lot here on legitimacy and justification for laws. If the basis is a racist assumption, why in the world would you expect people to go ahead and say, I'm going to risk my family starving in order to honor these type of rules? And I think it breeds that sense. It breeds that sense, right? When we're constantly using language about invasion and we're constantly using language about criminality, it doesn't actually help with the idea of an orderly border or a welcoming border. It very much creates this idea that we are at war. And I think that makes it more likely that people will not respect many of the requirements that are put in place.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I think that it also adds to the inhumanity of how people act at the border. And there's a book, The River Becomes the Line, or The Line Becomes the River. I think I got it mixed up. But it's a biography by a former border agent. And he talks about when people are pushed into these very dangerous and unsafe situations of trying to cross the desert alone, that when migrants become aware that a border agent may be trailing them, they will dump their backpacks and their water. And the agents, instead of looking for the people, their practice is to pour out the water and to empty the backpacks and burn the belongings or urinate on them so that people will not come back for them. These individuals are in the middle of the desert. That is life-threatening to those individuals. And the reason this agent said that they do that is because the migrants will give up hope. When people are coming because they are unsafe in their homeland, crossing the border is their hope. So it's very inhumane how these policies are implemented. Any questions? We have like 1 minute.
See, I mean, this is, terrible stories, and this is always terrible stories, and you just hear it all the time. My point is, what can we, regular folks, do to advocate for changes, in the border, how we can really kind of move all this effort and try to mitigate, all the harsh that these folks have to go through.
Thank you. I'm just going to paraphrase the question because it's being recorded. I want to make sure we get that. But the question is, what can we do?
Serene, you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, and I'm sure you will have more to add, Linus, but I think it's sort of a hard question because, of course, where do we start? But I actually think that one of the first places to start is around dismantling and decreasing the funding for the giant enforcement apparatus that exists at the border. And so like every year, year over year, CBP and ICE and all of those enforcement agencies ask for more and more money, and Congress essentially gives them more and more money. And a lot of that money is used for detention and for things that are incredibly costly to the government. And if it's actually poured into community support systems, it would be much cheaper and also much more effective and successful and humane. And so I think one place to sort of think about is, how are we funding the border and what are we funding along the border? Are we funding humanitarian assistance, or are we funding, harsh sort of weapons and guns and drones and all of those things that create very difficult circumstances, not just for the people coming, but also for border communities? So that's one sort of set of questions that I think we can tackle. And we do work on that very heavily in DC, actually. Our organization and many others kind of are part of a network called Defund Hate that works on minimizing appropriations for these kinds of efforts. Another is to actually look at one recent source of how draconian our system has become, which is the 1996 changes to immigration laws. So during the 1990s, there was this sort of tough on crime approach that was kind of building on some very racist sentiments and targeting of people who, interact with the criminal justice system. And that resulted in a crime bill in 1994 that President Clinton signed that really led to the mass incarceration crisis that we know today. And 2 years later, in 1996, a bunch of that was sort of transposed to the immigration system and made even worse in the immigration context. And so a lot of the ways that we process people today, like don't give them a chance to go before a judge to make their asylum case, anyone who has any kind of contact with the criminal legal system just faces massively cascading consequences and sometimes automatic deportation, no matter how close or deep their ties to the United States and how many mitigating circumstances there are. All of that really is kind of grounded in the 1996 laws that passed after the 1994 laws that targeted Black people in the United States, basically, and caused a crisis of mass incarceration. And so looking at those two things together and looking at the immigration system and the criminal legal system both, and looking at how those need to be changed in order to create a new system. And our organization, along with some others, are kind of lead organizations in pushing for something called the New Way Forward Act that would take first steps to fixing some of the worst excesses of the 1996 laws. And so that's something to work on. None of it is stuff that's going to happen in the next few days, or in the coming year, but it's sort of putting a marker like, okay, if we really want to fix our system, here are some of the key things that we should look at. And I actually firmly believe that if we focus on fixing the things that target some of the most marginalized and unpopular people in our communities, everyone will be better off. And that to me, that's actually a reason for why we should start there. But beyond that, I think you should definitely feel free to sort of like look on our website, look at other organizations that do immigration work, see where there are opportunities for you to contribute in different ways. And then also in your local communities, like sometimes there are people who come to your local communities who need assistance of different kinds. And I'm sure many of you are already active in that space. But then also just be aware of what's happening in Congress and in your local jurisdictions and show your support, like reach out to your representatives and show your support for things that are good and your opposition to things that are not. I know recently a bill passed in Minnesota actually that gives immigrant children like a much better shot at being able to stay in the United States. And that was very important. So there are many sort of local and local and federal things that you can sort of learn about and participate in and try to help make happen And you can, if you want to kind of learn more about that stuff, you can sign up for our newsletter on our website, and you will be kept up to date on different things that are happening in this space.
I'm just going to take a little bit of prerogative and just say one thing. One thing that I think is important is that the border is built on the idea of culture of scarcity. What I mean by that, it's always built on the idea of we can't have too many people because they will take away our things. And I think really one of the things, all of Serene's suggestions are really, really good on practical, specific things that we can do. But I also think what really needs to be done is creating a culture and ideology of abundance. That really this is not a matter. Like everybody coming into our border is not taking away something. They're adding something. And I don't think that is really appreciated. And if you look historically, it's always been at times of downturn, that things in times of chaos and times of uncertainty, that these views get their most weight. But they should apply all the time. We should be thinking about our country really as an area of abundance. There is no reason. And if there is a point in time that there are too many people in the United States, we are way, way, way short of that. And there's no reason that we can't consider ourselves as to be a culture of abundance and thinking about that, because I think the immediate thing is this amount of fear and the amount of divisiveness that is being caused by things like the border. So I would just say that is a little more hippy-dippy.
I think we are out of time now. Serene, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sorry for the technical problems. National Immigration Project is a membership-based organization. Look them up on the web, and if you're interested in getting involved, please do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to you both.